So next up, we've got Charlie Boisseau from Comms World, and he's going to talk us through the digital infrastructure for the inaugural UCI Cycling World Championships up in Scotland. So Charlie, thank you.
Thank you very much. Afternoon, everyone. My name is Charlie Boisseau. I'm CTO at Comms World. Before I start, and this might be a bit of a tough audience, given that we're all probably a bunch of sedentary nerds, but who went to or who watched the Cycling World Championships in the summertime? One, good, right? 2, 3, okay. Not many, that's what I thought. I was wondering whether that was going to be a horrifically unfair generalization, but yeah, you probably didn't notice this unless you're particularly into sport. But there was an event over the summer which was pretty exciting. This was the first ever combined Cycling World Championships. So historically, lots of different events throughout the year for the various different competitions in cycling. And this year, well, 2023, last summer, they decided that they would bring it all together and make one big event. So it was a sort of mini Olympics for cycling, which for cycling people was quite exciting. For us in Scotland, it was quite exciting because Scotland won the bid, specifically Glasgow and a few other venues won the bid to host it, be the host city. So they required a network for various different bits and pieces for that. And Comms World bid for that and won, which I'm going to tell you all about. It was a bit of a baptism of fire for us. We have done bits and pieces in the sort of live event space, but usually it's just a case of providing bandwidth to a venue. This was much, much more involved, so baptism of fire was probably an understatement. But before I get into that, I figured you might want to know a little bit who we are. So Comms World is a network operator headquartered up in Scotland, in Edinburgh, but operations all over the UK. Those of you who've been around here for a while might know us as Fluency. That was a business that I started and was acquired by Comms World. So what we do is basically provide services largely to business and public sector. So we provide lease lines mostly to these people. And the positioning of where we sit in there, I've sort of come up with this term, the Goldilocks network. And the reason for that is because we sit in this sort of nice space between having the scale in the network that you see there on the right without being a gigantic organization that's inflexible and difficult to deal with. So, you know, we're fitting a nice space in the market there with our scaling capability. So we do, yeah, business, public sector, and service providers. We do, now that we've got this national network, we're doing more and more sort of carrier-type services as well. We've got 125 POPs around the UK, a dark fibre, what we call our optical core network, which we lease up and down the country. And we've started building some of our own fibre as well, which is pertinent to this. We have on that core network a largely Infinera. It started life as Infinera. In recent years, we've been adding some smart optics to it, but we have a DWDM network there. Shout out to Smart Optics who are outside. They actually also provided some of the equipment for the network for the cycling. On top of that optical network, we have a Juniper MPLS network. And that's where we kind of offer most of that flexibility to customers. And I've underlined the bottom point there. We are, or I am, a maniacal control freak when it comes to operating that network and managing it and owning all the different bits of the infrastructure that we can. Typically don't see organizations of our size, you know, we're 145 odd staff operating a network to the sort of extent that we do. So why would we bid for this? Like I say, we're sort of B2B, public sector. It's a bit of an odd one for us to go after. I think, I might be speaking out of turn here, but I think we got recommended to bid for this through our relationship with Glasgow Council, who we provide the network for, and Scottish Government, who are obviously involved in the host city sponsorship. And And because we have a network that is pretty damn close to all of the places, that all of the venues that were involved here, the services that were needed were actually right inside our wheelhouse as well. We really needed to be able to provide, a lot of things like wavelengths and point-to-point connections, and actually manage a whole bunch of infrastructure on site as well. So we were well placed to do that. So we were asked to provide a few different bits and pieces to the network. The first thing was what they called the Broadcast Contribution Network. Now, if you've worked in live events, these terminologies might have been something you've seen in the past. To us, this was all completely new, and it felt like it was very much made up for the event, but apparently this is common terminology. So you have things like this Broadcast Contribution Network. My understanding is the counterpart to that is the Broadcast Distribution Network. The Contribution Network is the bit that basically provides connectivity from each of the venues back to a broadcast operations center. So in this instance, the broadcast operations center was being hosted at BBC's site in Glasgow at Pacific Quay. So we had to provide connectivity from each of the venues around Scotland and in Glasgow particularly back to BBC Pacific Quay and hand that off to the host broadcaster, which in this instance was Eurovision. Eurovision is the production arm of the European Broadcast Union, so they get involved in big events like this. The counterpart to that, which we didn't provide, was the distribution network, the broadcast distribution network, which was, I believe, managed by BBC and a few other people who already had infrastructure in place there. The other part that we needed to provide was internet access at all the venues, because there's an awful lot of different stakeholders that sit in these venues that need access. And that should be relatively simple, and I'll explain why it wasn't. But just providing internet connectivity to a site is straightforward for us. The next piece I'll explain in a minute made it a little bit more complicated. But there are loads and loads of different sort of consumers of these services at these events. So while we've technically got one customer, who is the UCI, the actual people who are consuming it, who we have to provide services to sort of directly or indirectly, are numerous, and there's hundreds of organizations involved. So it's a really complex event. We also had to provide some mobile connectivity for something which didn't occur to me, but is obvious when you think about a cycling event. You have specialist timing equipment that needs to time all of the events and make sure that that is very precise. And in this instance, that was being provided by Swiss Timing. Again, something I learned about the industry is Swiss Timing use various different brands. They're part of the Swatch group. They use various different brands depending on what the events are. In this instance, it was Tissot. And they were sponsoring the event and providing that specialist equipment to time the various races. In the end, we didn't end up using it just because actually Swiss Timing turned up with their own solution. It was a bit of a miscommunication, but we built basically a mobile 4G Juniper router MPLS network in a box with a UPS to go out to various places in the countryside. The last bit, and this was the real surprise, because we bid for the wide area network and the broadcast contribution network, the internet and everything else, and this bit was sort of left to the last minute, and we surprisingly won it, because this is not something we normally do for a sort of live event. We're used to doing LAN and Wi-Fi for schools and libraries and businesses and things like that, but this was very much a chuck it in and rip it out 2 weeks later, which felt very peculiar. But we won that, and that was really the bit that meant we really had to get hands-on, because delivering wavelengths and internet connections to a handful of sites is bread and butter for us. This stuff required an awful lot more manpower. So we got deep into that in a way I'll show you in a sec. So the solution for the broadcast contribution network was simple in theory. You have to provide some 10 gig waves from these, what they call their, again, apologies for the acronyms, they're not mine, the broadcast technology operations center at each venue. So this is where they would have the various media streams and camera feeds and everything aggregated from that particular venue into some equipment that then shoots that down the road to the broadcast operations center. So there's basically a number of different camera feeds. There's local editors and directors at the venue who are sitting in an outside broadcast truck, connected into a cabinet like that that's sitting in a porta-cabin or something like that. And they are putting together the feed for that venue. Along with that, there might be that edited feed plus a bunch of other feeds for people to watch online and other things that all get streamed down to the broadcast operations center. And that broadcast operations center is mind-blowing to me because it was mega, mega complicated. And I don't know what half of it does. Before I move on, I should just mention, for certain sites that were more significant in the event, we had to actually provide diverse routes, which obviously makes things much more complicated. So looking at that broadcast operations center, there are some, I mean, this is all new to me, and this is why I thought it might be interesting for you guys, because if you're like me, you probably touch a networking kit occasionally, but never touch broadcast kit. So my understanding is that there's these devices called Nimbras, and they take various feeds from each of the venues and allow that to be distributed into the various other sort of media equipment, editing and play-out type equipment that sits in that broadcast stack. So they're sort of taking in the feeds from those 10 gig waves and then letting the people at the broadcast operations center deal with those streams and do what they want with them. The other sort of significant component when it comes to the connectivity is this platform called LiveView. And basically what that does is, my understanding again, I might be wrong, I'm not an expert in this, but it takes the various mobile feeds and various things that might be coming in over the internet essentially and aggregates all of those, and it can use all sorts of bonding technologies and various things to make sure that you've got reliable streams from things like these cameraman on the back of a motorbike type situations where they have no choice but to use sort of mobile connectivity. So those are the two things that sort of aggregating those media streams together. And I'll show you some more photos in a minute of the editing suites and the production suites where they're actually using that, those streams. So how did we do that? I'll just show you our network. This is our network across sort of central Scotland. We've got, you can see in the blue color, we've got our sort of backhaul network, which is largely leased fiber. The pink's our own fiber footprint that we've been building out over the last few years. The main venues were in Glasgow. There was obviously Nevis Range up in Fort William, where the I'm not even going to try and remember what event was in Fort William. I do apologize for any cycling people. And Glentress, which is in Peebles, just in Scottish borders. There was also events in Stirling Castle. Well, Stirling Castle was the event that we had, the place we had to provide the connectivity to, but there were various events around Stirling as well. In Glasgow itself, again, we had various different events on the go. And we, at you know, the Emirates Arena, once I think known as the Chris Hoy Velodrome, Glasgow Green, which is a big park, George Square in the city centre, and the BMX Centre in Knightswood, all of that obviously coming back to the BBC Pacific Key Broadcast Operations Centre. So this was a sort of wavelength design that we put together. We looked for the fibre routing to see what we could find, and discovered that we could probably get most of it in Glasgow city centre using fibre from fibre that was existing. We have a product that we call Wavebearer, which is based on smart optics, and it's basically a bit of dark fibre or an OpenReach OSA, if we can't get dark fibre, with muxes and transponders on the end, going from our POP to the customer premises. And that allows us to not only provide multiple sort of active wavelengths like internet access and MPLS services and anything that might be coming from our Juniper network, but also patch waves from the mucks in the pop onto our core network or onto other routes to allow a very sort of flexible approach to patching wavelengths across a sort of metro region. So we delivered that to anywhere that we could. The only site that we couldn't get everything up and running was that was really required for the Broadcast Operations Centre was Stirling Castle. They really wanted diverse wavelengths, but we only had really an option because we only had one pop in Stirling to do a single route there. So we used an Ethernet service on the other side. All of these were 10 gig, and as you can see, we had to get 2 routes into the BBC Pacific Key in order to aggregate those various wavelengths, primary and backup wavelengths from the sites that needed it. So you can see the sites that were required to have diversity were George Square and the Emirates Arena. The other sites where we couldn't, we just built pseudo wires across the network. So we just put essentially a point-to-point Ethernet service from like Glentress and Stirling Castle back to the BBC. We probably could have managed to get some dark fibre into Stirling Castle, but Historic Scotland might have had something to say with that. Last time one of our colleagues had to do that, it was a bit of a challenge. So we didn't bother trying, and we just ordered an OpenReach OSA filter connect into Stirling Castle. Most of the sites in Glasgow were already serviceable with City Fibre dark fibre, so we ordered some City Fibre pairs. And again, this is all crazy for us, but we're normally used to customers signing up for 3-year terms on a lease line or a whatever, and here we are signing up a year's worth of connectivity, or 3 years in the case of an OSA, or a year with City Fibre for the purposes of 2 weeks of real use over it. But nonetheless, that was all budgeted for. It shows you the scale of the event. That all still makes sense. We already had some of our own fibre footprint going through George Square in the city centre, but there wasn't a particularly good route to the BBC and Pacific Key, so we actually costed in an extension of our network to build into Pacific Key. So we built diverse routes into the BBC from 2 of our POPs, the Central Exchange and our POP at the IOMART data centre in Glasgow, so that we could bring those, those various waves in there. Moving on to LAN and Wi-Fi. Now, this was absolute chaos because there's so many people involved. We had to provide a rate card for all manner of different people for different services. They would turn up and just say, I need an internet connection for my photographer or for my journalist or whatever it might be. And the list, the spreadsheet of various different demands that was required is colossal. There wasn't that many switches, but actually with every switch port needing an almost, no switch port was the same basically. There was 1,000 different switch ports that we had to configure all differently. It was a huge task. Yeah, 5,000 odd people connected to the 137 WAPs. It was reasonably big. Again, all of this had to get set up in a matter of a few days before the event or a couple of weeks before the event, and had to be torn out within a week afterwards. So it was an absolutely gigantic project. Running loads of fibre and copper runs around these various venues, point-to-point wireless bridges, everything and anything you can imagine to get these connections to the various different places around the venue. Just some of the use cases up on the screen there. Some of the interesting ones. Swiss Timing have this thing that they call the Commentator Information System. So this picture that is on the right here is what they call the mix zone. So this is where an athlete might come off the track and get interviewed by a journalist. So they would, this is a sort of area where athletes and journalists are allowed to mix, hence it's called the mix zone. And they have these screens up at the top for the journalists to be able to stand there and look at the various stats as they're maybe interviewing or preparing for an interview. So that's a proprietary thing that Swiss Timing provide, and it's displayed on those screens. There's also other screens around all the venues that they just called IPTV endpoints, and these are basically tiny little set-top boxes that plug into a TV, and they can subscribe to a bunch of different feeds. I'll tell you in a minute why that was potentially problematic. The picture on the bottom right there is just an example of one of our sort of flight cases that we dropped into a porta cabin or wherever it might have ended up being needed around these venues. And it was typically a switch, probably a fiber patch panel with some fiber going elsewhere in the venue, and a whole bunch of temporary Cat5, Cat6 cables run around the place, and a Wi-Fi access point. So we did loads of those sort of small installations all over the place. There wasn't really anywhere that there was a lot of IT infrastructure in one place. It was all sort of scattered around. This is the, what does it say up there? This is the video analysis positions. So this is, one of the areas that we'd have to provide connectivity because they would have photographers and people needing to upload video footage, high definition, and so there were a lot of demands for places like this. This one happens to be at the velodrome, but there were loads of these sort of locations that you might expect to see photographers around the site, and they all had a guaranteed bandwidth requirement. Swiss timing again. We had to provide fixed connectivity for these guys. They were many places that didn't need to use mobile connectivity. We would just provide them with wired connectivity. So we had quite a few endpoints to deliver for them. The actual team, if you like, the production suite at the BOC, they had services as well. This wasn't anything to do with the BBC, although the BBC was hosting, providing space, and providing resources and probably giving access to its connectivity for the distribution network. This was all Eurovision staff and Eurovision equipment and production and everything else. So they needed their connectivity provided to them as well for just general use. This is the local sort of production suite at a venue. I think that one might have been Glasgow Green. I can't remember. So they had a bunch of these positions at each venue that they would need dedicated connectivity that needed to kind of almost be air-gapped from everything else because it was so critical to the TV production. I've got a few more photos here, some of the things I had to do. There's Nick, who unfortunately couldn't be here today because he's unwell, poking around with some smart optics gear in one of the cabinets. The picture on the left is, I think, someone's attempt. They said, we'll put up some scaffolding so you can run a catenary wire across the track. And then they didn't like that, so we ended up having to route it a different way. And in other instances, we just simply used Ubiquiti point-to-point radios to get around the place. But we had all of this sort of engineering going on. And a lot of it was not really something you could plan for. We were only given access to Stirling Castle 48 hours before the event because it was a live tourist attraction. So, some of these things we had to just get in there and get it done. These are some of the good people that did it. I think the funniest picture there is the one on the bottom left. That's the guys in, I think, George Square in Glasgow, late evening after the event, ripping out all the cabling that they'd put in a couple of weeks beforehand, which was a little bit depressing, but that's the way it goes in live events, apparently. The chap on the far right, I should just give a shout out to because he helped me with a lot of the photographs for this presentation. His name is Martin Fitchie from Motion Technology Services. I needed to write that on my hand because I couldn't remember his company name. But Martin's a legend, and he was the guy who basically spec'd the tender that we ultimately won and was heavily involved in the production. But it involved an awful lot of people. It's a £50 million event. This ultimately UCI are putting on. The connectivity was a small part of that in the scheme of things, but it still involved hundreds of people. Probably 50 of CommsWorld staff got roped into this in an active way during the event. Last couple of slides. That video there is quite funny because this was turning up at Fort William a day or maybe 2 days before they were due to start, and we'd realized that we had asked a cabling contractor to go and do that one because we were short-staffed, and they basically didn't do it. So what we had to do is send all our boys up there one day and do an overnighter just to get it done. And it was just terminating Cat 5, but there were loads of Cat 5 drops that needed to be run, and we didn't really have any other options. So, these are the sorts of things you have to do when you're working on these sorts of deadlines. You just have to get everyone to muscle in. The overtime bill for the month was eye-watering, but the guys did it. They just got on with it and did an absolutely stonking job. They didn't tell us that they needed multicast on the LAN infrastructure, and when we selected Meraki, just because it's easy for us to manage and we use it for business customers, we've got a good relationship with Cisco, we thought that'll be fine. Turns out Meraki's not so hot at multicast. So these IPTV boxes that I was talking about, they subscribe to multicast, and there was just really random, sporadic instances where ports would just stop working. You'd configure an identical port next to it, plug in the IPTV set-top box, and it would work absolutely fine. So that was a pain in the backside. The wireless bridges were all great. Someone looked at a plan and went, I know, we'll put a wireless bridge from there to there, but of course nobody thought about the coaches that would be coming along and getting in the way, so that caused some headaches. The NIC had to turn up a wavelength from Glentress in Peebles. Thankfully, we just ordered some DFX out of Peebles up towards Edinburgh, and we hadn't used it yet, so we just basically robbed it and turned up a wavelength because we were getting jitter on the network and couldn't figure out where it was, and we ran out of time. So we just turned up a wavelength, as you do, which I thought was pretty cool for 48 hours notice. That secondary EAD that we put into Sterling that I told you about, because we couldn't get a second OSA in there thanks to distance limitations and all sorts of problems, we found that when you turn up these Nimbras, they just broadcast at 10 gig full tilt. And that was starting to cause us problems because we were having some capacity issues on one of our backhauls. So again, we just pinned it to an LSP on another backhaul that wasn't being utilized. And I think it was to do with hashing on a pseudo wire or something over a lag. It didn't like it. So we just pinned it to a dedicated 10 gig. And the last one is, it always happens when I turn up somewhere, is everything breaks. I swear to God I didn't touch anything. I did, someone said, Nick said, I might have volunteered you to do a talk at LINX. So you better turn up and see it all in action. So I turned up and with my phone and got photos taken of everything. There was a cabinet at the BBC at the BOC, and I was like, can I take a photo of that? Yeah, but you have to take the pink tape that's been stretched across it, do not touch, off it. I went, I'll be careful. Took the tape off it, swear to God didn't touch a thing, took a photograph of it, and I had one of the crazy Swiss guys from Swiss Timing coming racing going, what have you done? And I mean, I think it was only 1 or 2 ports that had gone haywire somehow, and it happened to be nothing to do with anything I touched, but it would be sod's law that when the CTO turns up, everything breaks. So this is just a slide that our marketing department put together, some stats. We're quite proud of this because it was a big event for us. It was a lot of hard work. It's obviously nothing in comparison to what other people have presented here before in terms of the Olympics and all these other things. But I think the takeaway for this is, for a company like us, as small in the scheme of things as we are, being able to deliver this sort of event and these types of services to such a wide geography and different use cases, etc., was a bit of a challenge, and I'm pleased to say we absolutely smashed it, and it all went off without a hitch, thanks to the team, and such a good job that everyone did. So, yeah, thought that might be interesting to you. Any questions? Thank you. Go for it, Neil. There was another hand up, but it's gone now. So
I just wonder, so the big challenge in the Olympics was network management. Mm-hmm. What, did you have to do anything there specifically around network management?
Yeah, we actually had a dedicated team on site throughout the whole thing. I had loads of photos of that didn't bother showing, but we basically had a dedicated porta cabin with our guys in it, and they were watching the network like a hawk. We had all our normal monitoring systems and everything, but we had basically, the way that we managed it was just to put eyes on everything 24/7. We didn't do anything special in terms of turning up the polling intervals or anything mad, but we were all watching very carefully.
Cool, thanks. Great presentation.
Thanks. Yes.
You mentioned earlier about how you were sort of ripping out all the stuff you'd laid.
Yeah.
Is there stuff you were able to leave in place for potential future contracts?
Yeah, I mean, it's not fair to say it all got ripped out. The stuff in the middle of George Square, which is a public sort of, you know, open space, that stuff obviously had to get ripped out, and that was the photograph. But obviously the fibre we put in the ground to get to the BBC and whatever, that was in the ground. That's there forever. The other venues, I believe some of them have asked to keep some of that infrastructure in place. I mean, it was all run very temporarily, so it's self-burying cable if you want to keep it for any length of time. But it was all steel wire armor cable and all the rest of it, you know. So it's fine. And I believe some of the other venues have kept it in place. So it was not it felt very wasteful because you saw some of those things going on. But yeah, in the scheme of things, I think actually the vast majority of it got reused. We obviously took all the equipment back and reused it. We've got, anyone wants some cheap wavelengths? We've got loads of smart optics gear in the warehouse. Anyone else?
Oh, Charlie, great presentation. Really enjoyed it.
Where are you?
I'm here.
Oh.
First question is, would you do it again?
Ooh, good question. I think we probably would. We learnt an awful lot. I think we would probably, the wide area networking connectivity is bread and butter for us. That's easy. We can kind of do that standing on our heads. It's the doing the LAN and the Wi-Fi and all that sort of stuff that just diverts so much attention because it requires so many bodies, and you don't just have those bodies spare. You have to take them off other jobs. So it's quite a big impact to the business in that respect. I think if we did it again, we would probably subcontract a bit more. And do a little less hands-on ourselves, just do the important bits ourselves and get a lot of the grunt work done by subbies. Anyone else?
Oh, that was your question, was it? Okay, great. A couple online.
Sure.
One relating to that one. What was the scrap value of all that copper?
Don't know, it's still sitting in the warehouse. We rolled it back up and I think someone's going to take it to the tip, so don't know yet.
Okay. And did you have any extra SLA or support considerations? And did you have any impacting fibre cuts?
Funnily enough, we didn't, as I was saying to Neil's question, we had people in terms of the support. I couldn't tell you whether or not we had a particular SLA that we needed to uphold. We probably did, but I'm not very close to that. In terms of fibre cuts, we did actually have a fibre cut. OpenReach managed to, I think they said it was a microbend, but we're not sure about that. But literally the day before the event started in Stirling, we had a fibre cut, and they resolved it extremely quickly. So I think these things happen. It was just unfortunate. It happens on such a sort of time-critical event, but. Yeah, they managed to fix it within a matter of hours. I think there was an awful lot of noise made about it, so they got their arse in gear. So yeah. Great.
Another one. Did you manually configure everything, or did you develop any kind of automation framework for ZT?
The Meraki's are so easy to set up. They're more or less zero config, other than the fact that you need to set up profiles for every different use case and then apply those to ports, which we would have had to do anyway, just on the basis that it would translate this gigantic spreadsheet into config for each of the different users. So there wasn't really any getting around that. The rest of the network was all wavelengths, so it had to be configured manually anyway. There wasn't really much we could do there. So no, not really, other than our usual tool set, which is decent-ish.
Okay. And finally, what sort of timelines are you looking at for a bid like this? Like, when did you first hear about it to when you actually won it and delivered it?
I couldn't tell you. Off the top of my head, it was reasonable amount of time to do the bid for the wide area networking. But because there were so many, so it might have been a couple of months, 2 or 3 months maybe. I couldn't tell you, that's a guess. But because there's so many changes at the last minute in these events with where things are going to be and whatever else, that they didn't actually know the sort of bill of quantities for the LAN and Wi-Fi until really close to the event. So we put in our bid for that and kind of just said, you're going to have to trust us that we're not going to gouge you when there's all sorts of changes, which we didn't. And they gave us the contract for that, just I think because it made so much sense to have one provider do all of it. But that was very, very close to the event before they actually gave us the contract for that. That was a few weeks.
Great, thank you. Any final questions? No, lovely. Well, thank you very much, Charlie.
No problem at all. Thanks.